Good morning and welcome everyone to this season of Primetime in the BU Library. If this is your first time being at a Primetime presentation, what it is really a celebration of learning inside and outside of the classroom. And these are often done by faculty, sometimes staff and students as well. And today's event is co-sponsored by the library and our office, the Office of Off-Campus Programs and International Studies. Coming up a week from today, on October 4th, the presentation will be an Edward Scholar presentation, and I'm going to read this very carefully off the paper. It will be Dr. Julie Hogan and Senior Sam Johnson describing how they redesigned a search for heavy particles called vector-like quarks and explored using deep machine learning algorithms to predict the identity of the original particle behind the showers of radiation these heavy particles create. Come back next week to learn more. But today we will be hearing from a student, a senior international relations major who's been working as a student in our study abroad office here. And she worked really hard to condense down into one presentation instead of having to come back for multiple presentations about her time in Cuba last semester. So let's welcome Alaina Turnquist.
Hello. Oh, let's see if it's on. Is this? Yeah. All right. Hi. Yes, I'm Alaina, and I'm gonna kind of talk about my semester in Cuba, what I studied, what I did while I was there, what I learned, and yeah. So, like Melanie said, there's just literally so much to talk about. I could probably give like 12 different presentations that would each have different topics about, religion or the political structure, the education system. There's just so much to say, so I'm going to try to be brief and straightforward, something that I'm not necessarily known for, but we'll get there. Yeah, so I kind of titled my presentation just like unlearning what I thought I knew about Cuba, because I think maybe more than other places, the US, there is a lot of misinformation about Cuba and just a lot of things that get shared or perspectives that get pushed. That we're not even aware are kind of being presented, but definitely shape our understanding of like what Cuba is and what it means to live there, and the history between the US and Cuba. And I think that gets framed sometimes in an unfair light, sometimes, or gets overly portrayed as negative or overly portrayed as positive. It kind of can go both ways in that regard. So yeah, just kind of addressing some of those misconceptions that exist. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about, kind of why I chose to go to Cuba. It's definitely kind of a unique thing. I think I'm the first student from Bethel to actually do a full semester there. We used to have an interim program, but no longer. And then just some of the adjustments that I went through getting there, as far as academics, host family stuff, talk about the academics and my homestay as well, really big parts of my experience there over the last spring semester. And then maybe address some of like the highlights. That's kind of like the fun stuff that I got to do, just all that. And then some of the more misconceptions, and that might be a little bit more academic, hopefully. But yeah. So why Cuba? I study international relations and Spanish. Those are my two majors. So it kind of is, Cuba is one of the most fascinating places to study as far as like their history of relations with the US. So that was a big pull for me in going there. Just to kind of get that first-hand perspective, or first-hand perspectives, because there's definitely not one main line towing as much as like the Cuban government might want you to think that is how it is. And then also Spanish, so like I don't have, because of like the isolation that exists, I don't have a ton of exposure to like Cuban dialect, and the way that, everywhere that you go, whether it's Spain or different countries in Central Latin America, you're gonna get a lot of different ways of speaking and inflection and tone and slang terms and things like that are very country specific, regionally specific within countries. So I kind of wanted to get that as well and develop that. It's not something I have a lot of Cubans that live in the US are maybe a little bit more removed from what it actually is like to speak in a Cuban dialect, just because of history and things like that. So yeah, and then also just the changing travel policies. It's not super feasible for me to live in Cuba in the future. Not that it's impossible, but there's a lot of other places where I felt like if I could study there, but I could also maybe live there if I wanted to. And Cuba just makes that a little bit more difficult based on like the structure of the economy and the very shifting relations between the US and Cuba that make it a little bit more of a dicey thing to actually be able to experience that on a day-to-day kind of a basis. And then also, contrast to former abroad experience, so like after my senior year of high school, I studied in Chile for a year, and I lived there through Rotary International, which is an exchange organization. They do a lot of like community philanthropy work, but I lived as an exchange student, went to high school for a year, and Chile and Cuba are just very different in a lot of ways, and so I really wanted to like get that similar language, I guess, in some regards, but that very much contrasting like the neoliberal to the socialist to even just the history within like the past 60 years and the way that the US is involved in those countries is very, very divergent. So I kind of wanted to get those, have that contrast, I guess. And then interest in the economic and governmental system and the Cold War. I just like studying the Cold War, so I was like, Cuba's the place. I don't speak Russian, so I was like, it's probably not going to work. Yeah, so adjustments, the academic structure. So what I did is my program through CIEE is called the Cuban Studies Program, and basically what that is I studied through the University of Havana, but my program was organized as a third-party program outside of Bethel. So that means that I was there with another group of students. There was 6 of us. We're in that photo in the bottom or in the top corner with our 3 kind of program director people with us as well. And there were 6 of us students, and we studied through the university. We chose courses at the University of Havana, lived in home stays, and that was actually one of the really coolest parts of it, I think, too, because I was just with people from like all over the US, so you get just such a variety of like college experiences, big school, small school, regional differences. You know, I don't really know anyone from the southwest of the US, and now I have friends that are like from New Mexico and stuff. That was one of the kind of unexpected cultural experiences, I guess, of my time there, was like, oh, even within the US, kind of learning. And then, yeah, the language and dialect shift, it was definitely difficult. Like I had a lot of experience speaking Spanish, and I didn't really have trouble communicating, but just the speed, and Cubans are known for, compared to other Spanish dialects, being a very open-mouthed dialect in the sense that like pronunciation is not key. So you can just kind of, like that's kind of how it is. So you have to kind of understand and learn to, it's an adjustment. Just takes a little bit of time, I think. And then also just safety things. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions I had going in, was like, it's gonna be more unsafe or less safe. I found it to actually be quite safe, which was really interesting because first of all, like with the revolution, there's not really many guns there anymore, so there's a very minimal amount of gun violence because there have not been guns around for like the past 70 years. And not to say, like, Cuba's government will tell you that there's no gun violence, that's a lie, but it's minimal compared to like other places that I've been, specifically like in Chile or in Colombia, just with more prevalence of gun violence in the streets and things like that. Also, there's just not a ton of drug trade or anything. Like, I think that is something that people kind of associate with Latin America, for better or for worse. And as much as, like, again, the Cuban government will tell you that doesn't exist. It does exist, but not to the extent that I would say you will see it in other regions, just because of the crackdown that kind of went into place after the revolution, and then also there's also kind of local governing structures that are very locally vigilant. So it's a little bit harder to kind of get away with things, because people will be like, oh, you have a new TV. Why does that person have a new TV and a new pool? And like, it just doesn't work like that. You know, if you're going to be making money, you're not going to be wanting to spend it in Cuba. So it kind of de-incentivizes that accumulation of wealth through drug trade kind of stuff. And then also the climate, it is so hot. Oh my goodness. I was like excited because I was like, I'm going to get out of winter. I'm not going to do Minnesota winter. This winter in Minnesota of last year went to like April, mid-April, and I was like, no. But it was like, it was so hot that like every day you would just be sitting somewhere and you're just sweating. Like, you're just not even moving. It's like hot yoga, but like your life, like all the time. Like, I'm serious. And I mean, you really do get used to it. It's so funny because you can always tell who's not from Cuba, just based on like who's wearing jeans and who's wearing like shorts and tank tops. Because people that live there are like, oh, I'm just living my life. It's like winter, and I'm wearing, you know, jeans and a sweatshirt, and it's like 85 degrees outside, and I'm just dying of heat. So that was kind of a bit of an adjustment, I think, especially initially. But you kind of just learn to sit in it. It's just, it's how it goes. Really, really, really humid all the time. So yeah, that was kind of a big adjustment, I think, for me as well. Internet. So yeah, Cuba has a really interesting situation with internet. I think a lot of people don't realize that the majority of the world does not have super great access to internet. And so, yeah, in Cuba, but the way that that is structured is because the government does really control most of the economy and things like that. The government also controls a lot of the internet access. And so what you have to do is, there are people that have Wi-Fi in their homes, but that is super rare. I think the only person that I met that had Wi-Fi in their house, it was like their mom was the coach of the Cuban archery team or something like that, where it's like she needed Wi-Fi to like coordinate archery. I don't know. But what most people do is you buy a card, as like this is showing kind of the front of it and the back. And on the back there's a code and you kind of scratch it off. It's like an iTunes gift card sort of, but you pay $1 for an hour. And yeah, so you can buy them with 1 or 5, and then you go to a park or another location that has Wi-Fi. It's generally parks, sometimes like bus stops or different things. So basically you'll just be walking down the street and there's like this entire park over there, and it's just full of people sitting there using the Wi-Fi. And honestly, this was a big adjustment for studying purposes, because I'm used to having just like very immediate access to Wi-Fi. A lot of my friends and family that I met while in Cuba and now is like, Alaina, why are you always online? And I'm like, I'm not always online. I just like, it just always shows that I'm online because I always have access to internet should I want it. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm always online. But I think that was one of the things I actually did really like, was because, I mean, if you're at dinner or something, there's no way to be on your phone, because if you're on your phone, it's like, what are you doing? Like, using the calculator? I don't know, like there's nothing to do, right? So like people just, it's not a super common thing. And I really loved that element of it, because I felt like I did actually have to interact with more people, or even just for studying purposes. Like, we sit around here with our laptops all the time, and that's just like not something you do. Like, if you're studying, you're reading, or you're doing this or that, you're not, you don't really sit casually with technology. If you're going to use technology, it's like, I'm going to use it. I'm going to make a list of these people that I have to email. I'm going to write the emails before I go. I'm going to go to Wi-Fi, get on my Wi-Fi, send like these 12 emails that I already wrote, and then leave, you know? And I think that that's one of the things that like I think I'll miss a little bit about Cuba. Should there be more kind of globalization and things like that, is just the way that Wi-Fi does really change kind of socially how people interact. So I thought that was kind of cool. Again, that's my perspective, because like as somebody that has Wi-Fi all the time, I know there's a lot of people that don't have that and would love to have it all the time. So yeah, and there is a bit of government censorship that goes into that as well, with the government restricting certain websites, like if you're familiar with like Freedom House or things like that, that are not available. And then I think also just by filtering search results, so like maybe you can get to a website, but it's not going to be the first thing that pops up on Google. Yeah, I would say that's kind of how it ends up being censored a little bit, and that happens in a lot of places in the world, not just Cuba. So yeah, that was kind of Wi-Fi, and you see you get that, you log into Nauta and it kind of clocks you down, and when your time's up, Wi-Fi turns off, and you go back to the rest of your life. But yeah, so that's kind of a picture of Wi-Fi park stuff there. And that's pretty new, even within the past like 5 to 7 years. Wi-Fi existing, they've had a really big push, and actually partnering with a lot of US like multinational tech company, Google stuff, to make Wi-Fi more accessible to people, because I think that's something Cuban people know is happening in other parts of the world, and they're like, why can't we have that kind of a thing, you know? especially the young people, getting Instagram and all of those kinds of things, right? Also, no Snapchat in Cuba. Fun fact, because Snapchat messages disappear. So unless you have a kind of a, what do you call it? It's a VPN server thing that you download on your computer, and it'll reroute your signal, and you can surf the web from like England or whatever. Then you can't use Snapchat because it's very hard to trace that kind of a thing. Currency. So this is a big adjustment. Cuba has 2 currencies, which is bad. Makes your life a lot more difficult. The reason that this exists is, for those of you that don't know, Cuba during the Cold War was very strongly aligned with the Soviet Union. So fall Soviet Union around like kind of 89 to 91 in there, when things kind of started to go bad. Cuba ends up kind of being on its own in a lot of ways. The Soviet Union was subsidizing the economy in this major way, allowing Cuba to basically just focus on sugar and nothing else. Sugar or tobacco, I guess, and then giving them things that they don't have as far as like natural resources within the country. So that would be like oil, and other kind of like machinery, things that are really essential to agriculture that they don't have the ability to produce on their own based on what's in the country. They need to get that from outside. And obviously, since the embargo and things from the US, they're not going to be getting that from the US or any of the allies that the US kind of made a pact with people, like, if you're going to do business with Cuba, you're not going to do business with us. And obviously, the US being the biggest economy in the world, people are going to choose the US in that situation. So kind of was a bit of a forced alliance, I think, in many ways, but also ideologically made sense. But when that went away, the Cuban economy really tanked, and it was very difficult. Like, people talk about periodo especial, which means like special period, and that was kind of like a 4-year period between kind of like 89, 90 to like 95-ish. It's kind of loose dates on that based on like when things started to recover. But it was very, very difficult. A lot of famine, a lot of just like inadequate medical resources, oil prices, currency fluctuations that, I mean, like, the government will still say that it's worth something, but it's not really worth that kind of a thing. And so basically what they did is a lot of people started using dollars, just American dollars, because there's a lot of people with family in the US or in Canada or other places, and they can send money in dollars. And what they would do is kind of a big black market for not even really illegal goods, just for like toothpaste or toilet paper, things like that, regular things you need. And so dollars were being used to buy that kind of stuff. And the Cuban government knew, and it kind of got to a point where it was so widespread that, like, to really crack down on it didn't really make sense. And so what they ended up doing was the Cuban peso, moneda nacional, which is this one in the bottom corner, was the original currency, and they ended up replacing the dollar with the convertible peso, which is known as CUC. So the top one is CUC, the bottom one is CUP. And they'll say that the CUC is pretty much equivalent to $1. Nowhere outside of Cuba is it worth $1. But, I mean, that's true, it's not. But in Cuba it is. And so, like, this is, and it gets super confusing because it makes it so hard. Like, I would say I would not worry about crime in Cuba. I would just worry about people paying you back in the currency that's not worth as much. And it's very hard to tell the difference, especially for people that haven't really spent a lot of time in Cuba. But the top one is worth $1, 1 CUC pretty much. Maybe even a little bit more than $1 sometimes. And the bottom one, 25 of a peso, moneda nacional, is worth 1 CUC. So there's kind of like, depending on where you are, it's kind of more beneficial to use one currency over the other. Most places accept both. It used to be that only Cubans are allowed to use the moneda nacional, and the other one is for kind of growing tourist economy and things like that, to be able to kind of track what foreign money is being spent in Cuba, what is actually being spent by Cubans. Now it's just kind of like whatever. They're really trying to wane off of it. Like, that's supposedly, like, you know, the Cuban Congress and stuff will come out with goals of like things they're trying to accomplish, and that's like one of them right now, that they want to get that out of there. I don't know if it'll happen. It's also kind of sad because, like, the moneda nacional is like the Cuban currency, that's like the original one, and it'll probably be replaced by CUC just because CUC is like a better measuring unit rather than CUP. So they'll probably end up losing the original currency for the one that like kind of more matches dollar amount in a loose sense, I guess. Yeah, so that was kind of an issue, just kind of trying to figure out what currency am I paying with, keeping the two currencies separate in your wallet and things like that. So if you ever go to Cuba, figure that out before you go. Really look at what money people are giving back to you, because it's very easy to get mixed up in that regard. They look very similar. That one at the top is worth $3, the one at the bottom is worth about like, 15 cents maybe. So, and then once you multiply that out, like, and 100 CUC is worth $100, and 100 CUP is worth about like $5. So it's not, you just gotta be careful. It can get dicey. So yeah, and then also stuff people know about Cuba, like the cars and things like that are pretty famous. There is a lot of old cars. I kind of thought that was like a tourist gimmick before I went. I thought it was like, yeah, I'm sure they have old cars, but it's like a thing that you don't really see. You do see it, and it's really common. The interior of the car, disclaimer, it is not the original car. The exterior shell of the car is the car, but most of the time, like the interior engine motor part under the hood, that's going to be like a Toyota, whatever, 2004 or something, But yeah, that's really common. There's kind of 3 generations of cars. In Cuba, you have stuff that's before the revolution, so that's like pre-1959, that's going to be like Chevrolet, Ford, any American model make cars. And those are really cool because they're old and some of them are well kept, some of them are not. One of the things that I was really surprised by was all the Soviet cars. There's so many Soviet cars, which was so cool because we don't have Soviet cars in the US. So as cool as it was to ride in like these old 1954 Chevrolet, whatever, I was also like, I want to ride in Lada. Yeah, and that's kind of from the Soviet era, and they actually do get a lot of, have a weird relationship with Russia that's like positive, sort of, in tentative terms, but get a lot of modern, there's one that also starts with an M that I just don't even try to pronounce, it's like all consonants. So, yeah, but that's a really big thing in Cuba as well. And then walking, I walk to school every day, which was super nice because it's not something I can do around here. And you can pay about 10 CUP, which is the kind of the original currency, so that's about 40 cents. And it'll basically, it's kind of like a rideshare system. It's like Uber, but obviously without internet, there's no Uber, so you do, it's a rideshare system. They run like different routes. That's pretty common in other places in the world as well. Yeah. And then academics kind of talked about this. University of Havana was studying with other students that go there, and studied kind of, there's a few departments that accept American students. That would be like political science, history, philosophy, and like the arts and letters. So that's kind of humanities based, so more literature and music, all that kind of stuff. And I studied Cuban literature that I had to do for my major. Was very hard. CIEE is the Center for Public Administration in Havana, and that is a course that was run through CIEE with all the CIEE students. So that was a group of the 6 of us, and basically what we would do is every week we had like a seminar, once a week on Wednesday, and there would be a different expert that would come in from Cuba to talk about whatever field it is that that person is highly specialized in. So that was really cool because it helped a lot in understanding the education system, how is it structured, the healthcare system, how is it structured, religion, what is religion like in Cuba, what is, like women's issues in Cuba and how is that dealt with, and I think that it helped me a lot because, I mean, as much as those conversations definitely did push a perspective that is sort of pro-government, it did help with a lot of information, just to be able to like talk with people and understand what it is that people know and what it is, the information that's kind of being provided to people in Cuba. And also just, there were things that I learned that were true that we don't learn in the US because it's just not something that the US wants to highlight, that Cuba spends less money on their healthcare and has arguably similar results. As far as like in terms of life expectancy and things like that. So Then Theory and Ideology of the Cuban Revolution, that was a really interesting class as well. We kind of learned about history of the Cuban Revolution, kind of the different stages, different reforms that went into place as far as agriculture, healthcare, education, literacy, campaigns, all that stuff. Nationalization, read a lot of Fidel Castro speeches, which was fun, and yeah, learned a lot. So those were kind of, and then television and music I was not planning to take, but I went to that class on accident because I thought that's when the literature class was, because, I don't know, the schedule was just a mess. So it turned out I was there at the right time, but it was changed, I don't know. So then I ended up there, and the students were really talkative, and it was more discussion based than a lot of my other classes were, and I kind of wanted that, like, I want to like actually hear what students have to say, and not that students are necessarily silenced in the other classes, but just the format of it was like, I'm going to lecture now and you're going to listen. And this was like, oh, we're going to watch this clip or watch this movie and then we're going to talk about it. And I think also because it did have an arts focus, like there is a bit more opening, whereas like the political science has to be like a little bit more hardline. And as far as like silencing or things like that with free speech, like I know Americans love to kind of rage on the free speech issues and things like that. I wouldn't say that there was a ton of silencing in the classroom setting. I would say that like it was more of a thing that like if you take a certain position and you become known for that, your life will get harder, kind of a thing. And harder in the sense that like maybe you won't get as good grades on tests, or like maybe somehow you'll just not be registered for a class that you were supposed to be registered for, and now you're in school for longer. It's sort of like those bureaucratic structural elements that just make it more difficult for people that maybe don't toe a certain line. But I definitely think like a lot of the students in my class, for specifically Theory and Ideology of the Cuban Revolution, did ask a lot of questions, and the way that you push back is you ask a question that forces the person who's responding to say something that just everyone knows isn't true. And that's like the approach I think I took also in Cuban studies, where people would be like, someone would get up and they'd be like, after the revolution, racism ended in Cuba. And you're like that's just not true. Like everyone knows that's not true. And like, but then you ask questions, you're like, oh, so this doesn't exist anymore. And then they have to be like, yeah, that doesn't exist. Or it does exist, but on a very low scale. And you just kind of force people to say things that just objectively people know aren't really how it is. My homestay. So in Cuba, there is kind of a private sector. I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. But I stayed at a homestay in a private home, and that's called a casa particular. And what that is basically people that are licensed by the government to allow people to stay in their homes. And these people actually end up making a lot more money than like most lawyers and doctors in Cuba. Yeah, so it was really awesome. At the bottom you can see there's a photo of me with my host mom. She doesn't really like to sit on photos. Her name is Carmen, and then my host sister Eileen. And then the cool thing about that is in Cuba, like the families are such that like you want to live as close to your family as possible. Typically, like that's considered generally desirable. So whereas in the US, I feel like people are like, I want to get away from my family. But so her oldest son as well lived next door to us with his wife and their daughter, who was like 4 years old. So that was kind of fun too as well. And they were just really wonderful, and I would kind of eat with them every day. We do a lot of go a lot of places together, to the store, or to different parks or things, or go on hikes or whatever, like just family stuff that people did, and I really loved it. And Eileen is currently studying architecture, so I actually didn't see her as much because she was really in the thick of it studying. But I spent a lot of time, especially with Carmen, and then with my neighbors, because of the way that the housing policies are in Cuba. You really live in a lot of times the same place. Like the U.S. is the opposite, where there's a lot of housing instability that is related to like people that are living at a certain income level that is pretty low, and that can oftentimes, because it's rent-based, it's really just, it's a lot of moving. Whereas in Cuba, because housing is considered like a right that everyone has, a lot of times when the revolution happened, like for example, the house I was living in used to be kind of like this apartment / hostel place, and owned by a landlord, and landlords being like the capitalist kind of in that situation. When the revolution happened, that was basically the government was like, oh, you live here, this is your house. And so that's how they got that house. And yeah, so but that means that there's a lot of permanency, and even buying and selling houses in Cuba for a while was kind of illegal or just like very difficult because it's, I mean, housing, we've seen in the US, like housing ownership and being able to, home ownership is a means to wealth. And it's a way that I think the government saw people being able to kind of capitalize on certain inequalities that they don't want to exist, and is not really in the interest of the classless society that is sort of like the goal, supposedly, in that setting. And also, so in my homestay also we had another room in our house, and that room was rented out sometimes during the semester to various students. And that was cool because just got to have a lot of random people from all over the world that were living there. So, you know, a group of girlfriends that are on a trip and they're from Ecuador and they're like vacationing in Cuba, or there was a few doctors that lived there for a while that were studying from the UK and doing kind of studying the Cuban healthcare system and doing research in Cuba during their last year of med school. So that was really interesting to talk to them. And then also just maybe different people coming from studying in the US, visiting for like a week. And so that was really fun as well to get to kind of like have, or like a weird Austrian professor who's like, just like all sorts of characters kind of cycling in and out. Yeah, and then excursions and highlights. So we got to visit a lot of museums. The Cuban Art Museum, if you have a chance, it's really cool. They did an event at the Walker Art Museum a year ago that I went to before I was in Cuba, so it was kind of funny because you saw some of the same pieces. But yeah, it was really, our program organized a lot of those events to just learn about like Cuban art, the Revolution Museum in Cuba that was in Havana that was really interesting. And I mean, it was a really awesome thing that we got to do, a lot of tours. We got to see some places where they grow tobacco. Tobacco's a huge thing, big in the colonial past of Cuba as well with sugar. And kind of learn about the process of like how is tobacco dried and aged and all that kind of stuff. Got to do some scuba diving, which was really fun. And the beach, of course, like Cuba has beautiful, beautiful beaches. So got to do a little bit of like just that typical like, I'm going to the beach, not gonna like worry about political theory or whatever for today, and just can go to the beach. We also got, so we were gonna go to Santiago, which is like the city that's the other end of Cuba, the eastern end, and that's like very different, because like the thing is my experience was in Havana, so like when I talk about Cuba, I'm really just talking about Havana. It's a very limited perspective, because Cuba's not Havana at all, and there's a lot of just lifestyle differences based on like where you're living, and Santiago has like much more of an African heritage than Havana does. Havana definitely has it, but it's much stronger in that region. And then also just like the Eastern dialect that is more common in that region, and it's almost like kind of a different culture as well. So we were gonna go there, and then there was all these problems with our plane, and we didn't end up going, so they actually ended up having our overnight excursion be in Playa Girón, which Playa Girón is like the way that Cubans talk about the Bay of Pigs. Playa Girón is like the beach, and then like Bahía de los Cochinos is like actually the way they say Bay of Pigs in Spanish. So there's kind of like that dual reference. But it was super fascinating. We got to go to the museum there and learn about that event. And I think it's very interesting because the only way I could kind of describe it, and I'm not really trying to make this equation necessarily, so don't like take it too far, but I would say that like the way that like Bay of Pigs exists in like people's national consciousness is sort of similar to like 9/11, I think, for Americans. Obviously like not necessarily the same in a lot of other ways, but I think like the place that it holds in like people's sense of like national identity is sort of similar in that regard, because it's a way I think a lot of people felt like kind of fears confirmed, I guess, about like the US being out to get them, the US controlling things, not just in Cuba, but like in the entire hemisphere as well. And yeah, so like it was interesting because it's also seen as just like a major victory, I guess, in that sense. for Cubans to have defeated the U.S. forces that, well, the U.S.-sponsored forces. They weren't technically from the U.S., and the U.S. tried to be like, oh, it's not us, and it's like, it was you, kind of a thing. It was. And it's very interesting because it's still a very contentious issue as far as like, you know, President Trump will go to like these events that like celebrate the Cuban American forces, and it's a very contentious thing still today as well, to see the U.S. like, I think, especially with the normalization of relations that happened and then sort of like didn't happen, people really want to see that apologized and addressed. It exists very prominently in people's memory. It's not like a thing that it was a thing that we just glossed over in history class and we're like, oh, it happened and it didn't really work out for us, but like it happened. That's not really how it's seen. It's seen as like, we knew that the Americans were trying to control us, and it's seen just as like a very anti-imperialist talking point, which is definitely something that's super important to Cuba. And then, so this sign here says Girón, primera gran derrota del imperialismo yanqui en América Latina, and that means Girón, so like Bay of Pigs, the first big like blow to Yankee imperialism in the Americas. And so I think Cuba kind of sees itself as like part of a larger brotherhood. Che Guevara is really big on this idea, like brotherhood between kind of colonized nations, especially within Latin America, because there's that shared Spanish colonial history. And so kind of I think they see, a lot of people at least see Bay of Pigs and like that victory against the American forces as kind of like this victory for like in a larger sense for America, like Latin America. Yeah. My family came to visit. I'll quickly go over this so we have time for questions and stuff as well, which was super fun. My grandpa came to visit with my sister, and it was really wonderful because my grandpa is obviously older than me, and that's one of like the biggest differences I see, not only in the U.S. but in Cuba as well. Just like a lot of generational differences on views, as well as class differences. I think class is a big determinant, and along with that goes race as well, because that's very, very tied in Cuba, with the kind of colonial past of like a lot of people that left Cuba were the Spanish, very strong Spanish roots, very white European kind of a thing. Yeah, so it's really interesting because my grandpa obviously grew up kind of from like the end of 1930s on, and so he really saw the whole development of the Cold War, and I did not. So it's I'm kind of coming in it from now kind of a perspective, and but it was just super interesting for him to be there, and something that I guess he probably wouldn't have ever thought was really possible a few years ago. So yeah, and that's the Capitol building. Fun fact: the U.S. basically, when they were like in charge of Cuba after the Spanish-American War, like just sort of made Cuba build the Capitol building to look exactly like the U.S. Capitol building, just slightly smaller. And so it's just kind of it's not even ironic, it's just like, yep, kind of a thing. Oh, another thing that was interesting, the transition of power between Fidel Castro to Raul Castro to kind of Diaz-Canel now. So that occurred while I was there in basically April 19th. Raul Castro, who's kind of like the pragmatic counterpart of Fidel Castro in a lot of ways, he's his younger brother, kind of stepped down from the presidency, and Diaz-Canel was, who's kind of like his protege, was established in that position. A lot of people like to harp on this of like, oh, finally, like, I think a lot of people ask me, like, oh, is Cuba, like, now the U.S.? It's like, no, it's still Cuba. Like, you have in Cuba kind of your way that you're in politics, and if you're that high up, not a ton of stuff is going to be changing. But I do think that, I wouldn't say that Cuba is going to become the U.S., but I would definitely say that that fresh perspective, like, there are different priorities, and he was not part of the revolution, whereas like a lot of people thought when Raul Castro took over for Fidel that the power within the party was going to change a lot, and that like there was going to be a lot of younger people promoted, and that just didn't really happen. And a lot of really young people, even if they're loyal to the Communist Party in Cuba, were super frustrated because they're like, we don't really see any young people represented, or even younger voices in the sense of like they didn't fight in the revolution. There was that like really big push to hold on to like if you fought in the revolution, like your position is kind of prioritized overall, and those people don't necessarily have like the best forward-looking vision. Even if, and the young people are saying, hey, like we agree with socialism, we agree with like especially this healthcare system and these things that are really important to us, but we just don't really think that like the current people in power have the vision to like correctly implement that. So that was kind of interesting because now he's, I do think that's like where you'll see changes is just like generationally different from the kind of old power revolution, 1959, people that really actually fought in that revolution are kind of phasing out now just based on age. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. He's at the United Nations this week if anyone is interested. Yeah, but also the Workers' Day Parade. Technically, CIEE does not let you go to political demonstrations, but in Cuba there are no political demonstrations. There's parades. So this was a parade that I went to, not a political demonstration. You can't prove anything. But yeah, it's basically for Workers' Day. Cuba really prides itself on like prioritizing the needs of the workers. It's a really big point of national pride. And so people are sort of, it's like one of those things where you're not really forced to go, but there's a lot of incentive. They call it like volunto obligatorio, which is like in Spanish, voluntary obligated to go. Like it's like it's your volunteer. Like you really don't have to go. No one's gonna like come get you. But like if you don't go, like maybe you won't be in a favorable position for a promotion or things like that. Yeah, and basically there's like this huge party. Also people go just because it's fun. There's like this huge party in the streets all night, and I was not planning to go, but it was right outside my window, so it was really loud, and I was like, well, I'm here. There's no way I'm sleeping. I was just gonna go to the march, but it was super loud. And basically just thousands and thousands of people march. And I think the government kind of sees it as like a way to show that the people support what the government is doing. So that's like a big, way that it's like publicized in newspapers and stuff. It's like, wow, look at how much people love the government and how things are being run, which isn't necessarily always true. I think that there's more love for the government than Americans think that there is. And a lot of, especially that's one of the things that really surprised me, like Fidel Castro, people love him. And like in a real way. Like I really thought that it was kind of just like from an American perspective, people just harp on him all day, but like there's a lot of respect, and there's definitely people that don't like him, but I would say that he's still super revered in a more general sense, just among like people, and like a very valued. It's like Jose Marti, Fidel Castro, right? Like right there, kind of a thing. And funny fact, so everything is named after Jose Marti. If you don't know who that is, look it up after this. But nothing is allowed to be named after Fidel Castro. There's like a law. You can't have streets. You can't have buildings, because everything, this is the annoying thing too, like everything's named after Jose Marti. And Jose Marti is a really cool figure, but it just like got it to be difficult because if everything's named after Jose Marti, nothing's named after him. Like it's like the airport is, the school, the whatever, like all of it. And we actually had a competition in our group of who could get the most photos with the Jose Marti busts, because it's like his little face, and it's everywhere. Like they literally got hundreds of them, hundreds everywhere, every government building, everywhere, every school, everywhere. So yeah, that was just a really interesting experience. And in the background, there's kind of Raul Castro's up there, right by Jose Marti. It's like the memorial for Jose Marti that everyone marches by. And fun fact, also, if you know FARC, they were there as well. So that was interesting. So confronted by like kind of my own misconceptions and bias, I guess I kind of thought that Cuba was like this, that they were pushing a narrative, that the US like wasn't pushing a narrative. And then I realized that both of them are pushing very strong narratives, and that the way that I've been taught about Cuba is from a very United States perspective and not necessarily any sort of objective reality. There's kind of shared truth that's somewhere in between. And the US has really controlled a lot and really not, I mean, honestly, as much as people don't like Fidel Castro, he was smart enough to realize that the US did not really care about them, and was not going to look out for their best interests. And like they've seen that Puerto Rico and Cuba have a very similar colonial history as far as like the Spanish-American War and like when they split off from each other or split off from Spain. And like a lot of Cubans look at Puerto Rico and say, you know, we lived through Hurricane Maria and other hurricanes as well that season, and like we have power, we have all this stuff. And it's because like we rely on our own government and we're not waiting for FEMA or the US to save us, because we know that's not going to happen. And that's just true. Like the US wanted to get the money it could out of Cuba, wanted to build casinos, wanted to make Cuba into like the Reno of the Caribbean. And I mean, I think that even if people have differing positions on like what the government is doing, Cubans pretty much almost universally appreciate that Cuba is not an American puppet anymore, like it was before the revolution. And also, it's worth saying that like as much as Fidel Castro people don't like him, the people that the U.S. installed in Cuba were not great either. The only difference is that they aligned with the U.S. interests, right? And in many ways actually have, like there's a lot of stuff about really horrible brutalities that were very much U.S. endorsed and U.S. Pushed in that place. So rethinking U.S. as a benevolent world power, and just the easy conclusions or like these things that people just recite out about Cuba, like the basis position that people have, that they don't really have any backing in like the facts of it, or in actually listening to people that live in Cuba and know the history. A lot of times is super reductive and like reductive and just like very convenient in the way that it doesn't address the ways in which the U.S. has been a big part of like impoverishing and exploiting Cuba for centuries. Yeah, learn and appreciate universal healthcare system. I could talk about that if you're interested, but not now. Just protecting patrimonio, which in Spanish is kind of like heritage, looser translation, I guess, not the best, but over like the bottom line, which I think has also hurt Cuba in some ways, but there is the government does care about preserving that stuff, and so I think that's something I learned to appreciate. And then also just the right to housing, and that's not necessarily something that always universally gets implemented, but I think it's something that at least they're striving for. I think in the US sometimes we don't really think that people deserve to have housing or deserve to like have basic medical needs met, and I really do admire that that's something that is prioritized. Even though there is a lack of resources sometimes that plays into that. Yeah, challenges. There's still a lot of poverty, housing crisis. There's not enough places for people to live. Just medical and educational resources are not there. There's a lot of racism, sexism, and discrimination. And then like on top of this, there's just a culture of denial around like all these issues that like, yeah, it doesn't exist. We don't have racism. We don't have sexism. We like don't have discrimination based on these things. Like it does exist, and the government just doesn't want to admit to that, and that like is a very much a barrier to like actually addressing what's going on. Or if they will admit to something, it'll be like, yes, but we're doing like these things to rectify it, and that might not be fully addressing the problem. So yeah. And then to Cubas, there's very separated tourism and people that work in like government sector stuff is very, you can have people that make $30 a day, you can have, or like $30 an hour driving taxis or things like that, and then you can have people that make $30 a month. And it's just, it can be very, you can kind of live on either of those salaries in Cuba, but it's just very divided, and I think that's not decreasing. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. My question is, how will Cuba change as the younger generation comes into power? What is globalization and just like younger people seeing how the rest, well, not the rest of the world, but I guess like the Western world and specifically countries that have power to control media. Like I think that's where a lot of Cubans compare themselves to like Europe or something and don't realize that still the majority of the world is in a similar position to Cuba. In a lot of senses. And is there a possibility of the U.S. changing its trade embargo with Cuba in the near future? Probably not, because people that really care about keeping it the same have a lot of money, and the people that would maybe be okay with changing it have issues that they care about more. yeah, and is Cuba's infrastructure and economy really even prepared to have something like that change? It would be a huge shift. So yeah, recommended learning materials. I'll leave this up if anyone wants to look at it. But really, look at the ideological basis of what you're consuming, because I watched some stuff and read some stuff before I left that when I came back I was like, whoa, that had a super strong perspective and I did not even know it. And now I see it and I'm like, wow, it was really strong. So just be aware, because there's not a lot of stuff out there that's like trying to present an objective reality of Cuba. Not that one necessarily exists, but there's not a lot of people that, everyone's got an agenda is basically what I'm saying. Yeah, so thanks for listening. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but if you have questions or you want to ask me after, feel free. But thank you for coming. Yeah. If you have questions, you can ask, or if you have to leave, I know that there's like class and stuff as well. So yeah.
Wow, Alaina, that was a lot.
Yeah, so overload.
How much did you know about that before you went, and how much kind of came out in those classes and seminars?
I think I knew a decent amount before I went, or I thought I knew stuff. I think I was pretty well educated on the American perspective on, or American perspectives on things. But I think what I realized was even the stuff that I kind of knew, I hadn't really contextualized it in the right way, that because I wasn't contextualizing it, it wasn't really true in the way that I thought, if that makes sense. But yeah, I definitely read a lot of stuff, and just talking to people helps a lot as well, and reading. So yeah, I'd say I learned most while I was there. But yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, if you have anything to ask me, feel free. I could talk your up all day. So, didn't even get to the medical system or the education system or anything. So, yeah, but thank you for coming. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.